Fáilte roimh tróna go dtí agad a riagan na héireann agus chuig an séomh agus an léocht dhearannach sa trá léochtaí Colum Cille 1500 Téacsanna agus Traidisiúin. Is mis mórí na ceann agus tá seach an fáilte speisialta chu roimh haar cean leabharlann an acadamh agus haar cean chuiste léan na Gaeilge, litríocht na Gaeilge agus na Gultúr Celtach a dagrig an trasha i báirt lena chéile. You're all most welcome to the Royal Irish Academy this afternoon and to the 6th and final lecture in the series Columba 1500, Texts and Traditions. My name is Maureen McKeown and I'm welcoming you here on behalf of the Academy Library and the Academy's Irish Language, Literature and Celtic Studies Committee, who co-organised the series. These lectures were one of a number of Academy initiatives to mark the 1500th anniversary of the birth of St Columba, née of Colum Cille. The series programme aimed to foreground recent research on the Columban heritage across a range of academic disciplines and also to highlight the rich Columban treasures held in the Royal Irish Academy Library. Tá fáilte chrial ríist ar gardan agus ar nábíon as alaba a dúchan an eile rétan agus a tíran céin an eile níos féidir as ar bhuain a há cólar in ríis in dia. This series commenced with an exploration of the Columban tradition in terms of visual art and the manuscript tradition. This afternoon, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Anne Buckley, who will bring the series to a conclusion with a discussion of some of the musical and liturgical aspects of the Columban heritage. I'll now hand you over to my colleague and committee member, Anne Buckley, who will introduce Anne and chair the session. Gur míle maith agaibh.
Karsten, good afternoon. My name is Maureen Jonrachain, as Maureen said, and I'm welcoming you here to the final lecture in this series commemorating Colum Cille. Before I tell you about our speaker today, can I just remind you that questions can be, or comments can be sent in, but via the question and answer facility, not through chat. Now, we're very fortunate to have today's speaker, Dr. Anne Buckley, who will be not only speaking to us academically, but I believe is going to end this series with some beautiful music. Dr. Buckley is a research associate in the Medieval History Research Centre in Trinity College, Dublin. Her research interests include the patronage, production and use of liturgical manuscripts in medieval Ireland, the liturgical cults of Irish saints in Ireland, Britain and Europe, song and society in medieval Europe, and the history and archaeology of musical instruments. She directs an international multidisciplinary project, AVRA, focusing on the liturgical and musical legacy of Irish saints in medieval Europe. And it involves a consortium of musicologists, historians, theologians, librarians, and archivists. She's also currently engaged in a project funded by Fóras na Gaeilge to prepare a musical reconstruction of the Abhra Colum Cille, which we've heard about already in this series, in collaboration with the Swiss singer and instrumentalist Hannah Marty. A CD recording is currently in preparation, and those of us who have heard Anne's musical productions know that they are just glorious. Her publications include Music, Liturgy and the Veneration of Saints in the Medieval Irish Church, of the Medieval Irish Church in a European context, and Music and Liturgy in Medieval Britain and Ireland, edited by Anne Buckley and Lisa Colton, which is forthcoming in 2022, along with other edited collections and individual articles on music in medieval Ireland, Latin and vernacular monophonic song, and the history and archaeology of musical instruments. She has published extensively on musical imagery on Irish and Scottish high crosses. So I'm going to hand you over to Anne now for today's lecture, which is entitled Devotion to Colum Cille in the Medieval Liturgy. Anne.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation and also to your colleagues at the Royal Irish Academy. I'm very honoured to have this opportunity to speak to you today. So I'm going to speak about the celebration of Colum Cille in the liturgy. And I want to begin, first of all, by explaining what we mean by a liturgical office. The liturgy consists of the Mass and the office, essentially, and the office was a cycle of prayer and chant, which took place over a 24-hour period, beginning with first Vespers on the eve of a feast and continuing through Matins, Lauds, and so on until second Vespers on that evening. Now, the celebration of the office would include not only the main feasts of the church, such as Christmas, Epiphany, Easter, Pentecost, and the various Marian feasts and those of early Christian martyrs, but also saints of local significance who were venerated in a particular region or ecclesiastical network. And in these cases, what was called a proper office was composed with texts and chants specific to the individual concerned. Another indication of the importance of a saint in a particular region or community is the ranking of feasts as a double, a major double, a simple, or simply a memorial. The number of readings or lections included in the celebration of Matins, the whole of that section could take up to 3 hours, and the way in which the feast is listed in the calendar of the respective liturgical book, particularly breviaries and antiphonries, as well as martyrologies. An important feast was highlighted in red, a so-called red letter day, whereas those of lesser rank were in black. In the case of Colum Cille, there are 3 surviving offices. There is one complete office in 3 different manuscripts and a 4th with processional materials. There are 2 Scottish offices, and many more manuscripts list his name in the calendar, sometimes in red, sometimes in black. And we may reasonably assume that at least in some of these cases where he's in the calendar only, but not necessarily in the sanctoral, that at least some, if not all, of his office will also have been celebrated. In the text of the offices, both the sung texts and the readings, we can usually identify some of the hagiographic sources which were used by the compilers. The history of the transmission of these sources can be complex, often with many twists and turns in both the physical and editorial routes over the centuries. But from the 12th century in particular, abbreviated lives were produced specifically for devotional reading and for use in the liturgy. In the latter case, these were sometimes compiled into separate books known as lectionaries. And it is these readings which were drawn upon for the office and inserted into breviaries which contained all of the required material for the celebration. The feast of Colum Cille, or Columba as he's known in Latin, is celebrated on the 9th of June, and that of his translation the following day, 10th of June, as a combined commemoration of the translation of Patrick, Columba and Bridget, whose bodies were reinterred, according to the story, at Downpatrick, County Down in the 12th century. But we are concerned here only with the office of Colum Cille himself. I'm going to speak first of all about the Irish office. It is found in 3 sources, and none of the Irish copies of the Irish office has any music notation. One is Trinity College Dublin manuscript 88, a Serim breviary from Dublin, dating to the first half of the 15th century. The second is now in the Bodleian Library, Oxford, a 15th century English portable Serim breviary adapted for use in Ireland. We find many examples of liturgical books which were originally written in England and then brought over to Ireland and with additional local materials added, and this is one such case. And thirdly, we have an Irish Serim breviary in Aberystwyth in the National Library of Wales, dated to circa 1400. With the Columba office added at the end of the sanctoral, which shows that it was adapted for some subsequent purpose. While interestingly, the offices for Bridget, Patrick and Finian are in the main part in their correct calendar sequence. The Irish office is a fully rhymed office of 9 lections. The text is largely identical in all 3 manuscripts, save that the antiphon, that the Aberystwyth source has 1 antiphon for first Vespers, whereas the others have the full complement of 5. This could indicate that it is an earlier version of the office, which was subsequently extended, or that it was given less importance in the places or place where this breviary was used. Now I'm just going to turn to my PowerPoint. There we are. Sorry for this slight delay. Now, just to show you examples of how the calendar looks in a liturgical book. Usually it's 1 page per month. So occasionally it's 2 months on the page, but for most of them have just 1 page per month. And here you can see this is the month of June, and the calendar here shows the feast of Columba, abbot, in a Carmelite missal from Kilcormac. And then we have in this Aroasian breviary from Trim, we have him again. I've shown you a better enlargement here. Columbae abbatis et confessor, 9 lections, along with the feast of Primus and Felicianus. The number of lections, as I mentioned, is quite significant. If there are 9 lections, it's an indication that it's an important feast. And then in this next item, we have, just a moment, I think yeah, that's better. Yeah. Here we have the translation of Patrick, Columba and Bridget, which is on the 10th of June. And in the line above here, you note that we have Columba only added in the margin. And this is an interesting subject that I've been spending quite some time on over the last few months, looking at the relative importance given to particular local saints. And in many of the cases that are associated with Anglo-Norman Ireland, as indeed are all of the Irish Sarum manuscripts, St Edmund of Abingdon is often given precedence because he would be the standard saint, the usual saint referred to in the Sarum breviary. So in the Irish manuscripts, sometimes Columba is added in the margin in a little small hand like that. Sometimes he's added in bold red, but normally Edmund is there first of all. But invariably, you'll find Patrick, Columba and Bridget having their feast of the translation on the 10th, and there's no conflict there. So that tends to be more persistent. While it would be difficult to ascertain where this Irish office was compiled, it contains several references to Hibernia and to Columba's Irish identity. And in the following example, we have a reference to the monastery at Swords in the 9th responsory of Matins. This is striking, since it is the only local reference in the song text and might therefore be of special significance. And I should add as an aside that this is a feature of the offices of many local saints, not only in Ireland, but in English Historia, the Historia being another word for the office, and in other parts of Europe as well. Which shows, I think, and not just the importance of the saint, but how they personalized these offices in a way that had a special significance for them. So the reference to Swords is a unique reference that I'm aware of, and I thought it might be of interest here, because the Columban Monastery of Swords is thought to have been established by the Hiberno-Norse of Dublin in the 10th century. And it was subsequently the location of a week-long fair established by 1193 under the Anglo-Normans. Before that, Swords was known for its dedication to St. Bridget. And there are echoes of her Irish office in 2 of the chants for Columba. namely the first responsory of matins, as you can see here, Happy Hibernia bor Columba, Felix Hibernia Columbam genuit, and in the case of Bridget, Felix Hiberniam beat Lagenia. This is often a gift also to music historians like myself, because seeing as the Irish office has no notation, we have the Office of St. Bridget, which is fully notated. So this helps us very much in reconstructing at least some of the items. And between the first antiphon of Lauds and the hymn for First Vespers of St. Bridget, we have another similarity, the days Ades Dies Laetitiae. I should add that this is quite a common celebratory text for saints all over the European chant tradition. It's not special to Irish tradition, but I think nonetheless that there are resonances there because the similarities are quite close. It's not just the opening line, but the whole thing has resonances. And I do wonder sometimes whether when people were singing the one, they were thinking of the other because they knew the repertoire so well, particularly with the significance for swords. Close similarities also exist between two matins offices for Columba and those of Canis. And here we have Canis, as you I'm sure know, is associated not only with Kilkenny, but also with Finglas and one or two other Dublin areas. He was also known to have been a close friend of Columba's and to have spent some time with him on Iona. So again, this may have particular significance for those who composed the office as well as those who sang it. That is the Matins Office Antiphon 7. And then we have the 9th antiphon has similar resonances between Columba and Canis. And now we have the Lord's hymn, Jesu Redemptor Omnium, Jesus Redeemer of all, which is a widely known hymn, which is found right through the chant tradition, and you will find it in many parts of Europe. But again, it's interesting that we can compare the two, the Columba and the Canis texts here, with many similar words. Another source of proper chants for Columba is found in Marsh's Library, Dublin, which is a processional dating to circa 1400, early 15th century. This is one of two processionals from the parish of St. John the Evangelist, sorry about that, which was in Fishamble Street and which was served by Christ Church Cathedral. And we reasonably assume that books associated with St. John's were probably made for or shared with Christ Church. I have the text of this now, of which I'm going to play a recording. It is the processional antiphon, which would have been part of the eve of the feast itself. The melody of this antiphon is very similar to one from the Common of Virgins and also the Office of the 11,000 Virgins in a number of 12th century North European sources. And again, one is wondering about the resonances here because the references to Columba have to do with his chastity, virgin, teacher, and so on. And again, we really need to get into this entire repertory, not just the local repertory, but the wider repertory to understand a lot of the nuances there. So I think it's no accident that this particular chant was chosen, this particular melody was chosen for the text. Sorry about that. Now I wish to say a few words about the Scottish office. There are two Scottish offices with some small amount of common material. The first is to be found in the so-called Insculum Antiphon, which is actually now in a fragmentary state. Therefore, we're limited to some extent as to our possibilities to compare it with the other full office. It's a fragmentary source now in Edinburgh University Library, missing all of First Vespers and Matins, apart from the end of the final responsory and verse of Matins, leaving us with mostly chant for lauds, for the octave, and Sunday within the octave. It also contains items from the Office of Corpus Christi. The original source is dated to circa 1300, with subsequent additions and emendations over the course of the following 2 centuries. Previous studies of the Insculum material have been concerned particularly with the sources of the music. Isabel Wood's Priest, the first scholar to publish on this, was convinced of its local flavour and believed that along with Gregorian chant, known elsewhere, others in the antiphon were unique and perhaps local compositions, therefore. Her article was groundbreaking in being the first not only to address this source, but also to bring the discussion of Scottish chant into a wider framework of reference in the study of European chant at a time. And I have to say this in her great interest in terms of her pioneering spirit as well, at a time when chant databases and online electronic resources were far less developed than today. Since then, Kathleen Kennedy Steiner followed up with another study in which she revised some of the original layout and demonstrated that all of the material belongs to the wider repertory, with some contrafacta, that is, melodies used to different texts, specifically from the Office of St Andrew, which obviously is of high significance for a Scottish office. She also explores in very revealing detail the theological and biblical significance of the texts. The presence of proper material for the octave, and I should maybe add that proper means specific to the occasion. There's the proper and there's the ordinary. So proper material for the octave indicates not only that the feast itself was celebrated extensively with chants and prayers and readings, but that a whole week of liturgy was set aside for the veneration of Columba at Insculum, which underlines the importance attached to him at the abbey. Insculum Abbey, formerly priory, was founded in 1123, an Augustinian house situated in the Firth of Forth under the protection of Dunkeld Cathedral and dedicated to the Iona saint, as was Dunkeld. A reference in the Magnificat antiphon for second Vespers, Sanctorum Piissime Columbae, mentions this place that is dedicated to you. I think I have mixed up my slides here. I'm very sorry about that. No, I'm right. Excuse me. I'm all right. Tu speculum ecclesiae, you mirror of the church, protector of the fatherland. Look upon this choir. It's unusual to have such a reference in an office. Indeed, consider it more completely worthy and most holy of saints, and may Christ's mercy, by your prayer, watch over this place dedicated to you. So again, it really does reinforce the local relationship, the local bond that existed between the saint, the office, and those who were singing it. O Columba insignifer, the Vespers responsory for the octave of the feast, refers to Columba as a protector against evil and against the dangers of the sea. Again, highly significant when you consider the circumstances in which such a community would have lived. The source of the melody, Dixit autem Dominus, also a responsory, is a chant for Quinquagesima Sunday. Its text refers to God's covenant with Abraham, which subliminally underlines the figure of Columba as spiritual father and protector of his people. But before I go on to that, I will play you a recording of the Vespers responsory.
O Columba, insignififer, hostes laetitiae, ucarem adire. Tuis ut placeat, circumdatis salere. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto. Tuis ut placeat, circumdatis salere.
Sorry about this. Excuse me. The theme of protector against the elements is further emphasized in a quotation from the Old Testament book of Sirach, used for the versicle and response at the conclusion of Matins. And at his voice, the wind was still, and by his thoughts, he calmed the deep. And in a reference to his healing miracles, he is addressed as Hope of Scots in the commemorative antiphon for Sunday within the octave in the Insculum Abbey. I should just mention here, Scotia most certainly means Scotland in this case. In earlier texts, we have Scotia possibly referring to either Ireland or Scotland, but at this time, and obviously in this location, there is no doubt. And here we have, I think, a very moving text: mouth of the dumb, light of the blind, foot of the lame, stretch out a hand to the fallen, strengthen the vain, and correct the mad. Turning now from Columba's character for kindness, for charity, and as protector of his people, to matters more biographical. Strophe 4 of the Lauds hymn, Aurora Rutilat, which I will play in greater detail in a moment, it contains a reference to his taking leave of his Irish homeland, relinquishing his fatherland, dear Ireland. Through Christ's grace, he came to Britain, through whom, through appropriate beginnings of life, the king raised up the peoples of Britain. We have an example from the particular folio of the Insculum Antiphon, where the hymn begins just here.
Lucis prenuncia, letos nos excita. Aurora rutilat, lucis prenuncia, letos nos excitat, a somnolentia, volentes celebre, festum recolere, affabilis, voltu virilaris, vir venerabilis, ortu vir nobilis, vir status stabilis, corpore Deus et mente. Colum emerita et signa singula, facta prophetica, clara miracula, vel dictis dicere, vel scriptis scribere, nemo novit totaliter. Relinquens patriam, caram ibeniam, per Christi gratiam, venit Britanniam, perque donea vitae primordia, rex gentis sum sit Britanniae. O Pater Patriae, Pastor egregiae, Columba tribue, nobis spem veniae, et labe criminum nostrorum omnium, nos munda sancte Columba.
Now, sorry, we're moving to the next item. Can you hear me still? Yes, okay. The melody of this hymn, Aurora Rutilat, is in fact a contrafact of the hymn for the Feast of the Guardian Angels, which was celebrated on the 2nd of October, Custodes Hominum Psalimus Angelos. And here again, there is perhaps a subliminal reference, this time to Columba as protector, and perhaps also evoking the early Irish notion of singing a hymn as a breastplate or armor, a lorica, against both physical and spiritual peril. I had planned to have the entire recording running through this, but I had this technical hitch for which I apologize. Now we move to the other Scottish office, which is from the Aberdeen Bravery, which has some elements in common with Insculum and may indeed have had more if more of Insculum had survived. The Aberdeen Bravery is a printed book without music notation, published in 1509 by William Elphinston, Bishop of Aberdeen and founder of its university. It was compiled from miscellaneous older sources and includes a full office for Columba, partly metrical and partly in rhyme. Unusually, it contains 3 different hymns, one for First Vespers, one for Matins, and one for Lauds, of which the last, Aurora Rutilat, it shares with Insculum. The hymn for First Vespers, Consinat Nostra Consio, opens as is common with an invitation to celebrate in song. Then there follow references to his Irish origin, namely to his departure from his homeland, which is compared with the example of Abraham. He was born in Ireland of royal stock, and in tender youth he longed for heavenly things, for he imitated Abraham in leaving his dear homeland, despising the glory of the world. He loved nothing before God. And this too links in with the whole concept of Columba as the father of his community. I suppose you could say it's a cliche to some extent, but Pater Columba and his role as protector and as you know, as an ancestor almost, is very strong in the office. He was head over the peoples of the Isles, which refers to his being an islander, and this is referred to in the second Vespers Magnificat Antiphon. Head over the people of the Isles for 7 years, he was king, he dispensed both laws, he stood as king and teacher. And the hymn for first Vespers refers to his healing miracles in strophes 7 and 8, the latter echoing Insculum's Magnificat Antiphon for second Vespers, Os Mutorum. Giving health to the people by the sign of the Holy Cross, he drove out diseases from the sick and gave life to the departed. The same versicle and response as in Insculum, based on Sirach, occurs also at the end of Matins. And there are several other textual references in common, but with different word settings. There may have been more such instances, but bearing in mind the lack of missing materials from Insculum, we have to regard Colum and Aberdeen as two distinct and separate offices, nonetheless drawing on common hagiographic and perhaps other now lost liturgical sources. And for my final section, a few words about Columba's cult in Irish continental monasteries. We have quite a lot of information on his life, but his liturgical cult is harder to capture. Unlike other Irish saints such as Patrick, Bridget, Columbanus, Gall and Cillian, Columba's cult disappeared largely with the withdrawal of the Irish communities in the course of the 12th century. In that context, an Hiberno-Latin hymn dedicated to Columba and Boethana, known as Boheen also, who was a subsequent abbot of Iona, exists in a fragmentary source. I should say that Columba and Boheen were very close. He was related to him and they had a very close friendship. And it's interesting that they have come together in this hymn, and it's, in my experience, unique. I haven't seen anything else that brings the two of them together in a hymn or in a liturgical context. In that context, then, therefore, this is a very interesting source, and it is something that has survived among the fragments of the Schottenstift, the Irish Benedictine monastery of Vienna, which was founded in the 12th century, late 11th and early 12th centuries. This is the only hymn to bring them together, as I say, and although Boheen does have a vita, and he is listed occasionally in calendars. While it seems likely that this particular copy, like other fragments in that collection in the Schottenstift, were brought from the Regensburg Schottenkloster, the founding community for the Vienna house, along with other manuscripts in 1155, there is a very real possibility that such a hymn might have been in circulation independently of the Benedictine congregation and over a longer period of time, and moreover, that it may have been composed on Iona and transmitted to the continent via another route. In the 8th century, a close relationship was developed between Iona and Salzburg during the abbacy of another Irishman, St. Virgil or Vigilius of Salzburg, circa 700 to 84, who was also abbot of the monastery of St. Peter in Salzburg. Virgil established a brotherhood of prayer, known in German as a Gebetsbruderschaft, with Iona, where it is believed he also spent some time. Both in this hymn and more generally in the offices discussed in this chapter, the reinforcement of community bonds is seen as a central function of the liturgy, representing the connectedness of those who lived, worked, and prayed together, supporting each other through communal worship and shared identity. These bonds were further strengthened by a sense of place and of spiritual kinship in the more personalized texts of local saints' offices, in this case, the figure of Pater Columba. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that very erudite lecture, beautiful music. It was such a wonderful complementing presentation to the other papers that we've had in this series. And you've made what is possibly an area of learning that is not necessarily terribly familiar to many, say, Celtic studies. scholars. You made that very accessible, and we're very grateful to you indeed. Thank you. I should say to everybody that we have, when I looked, there were 114 people present at this lecture. You're very welcome now to send questions. I see there are some in already. I'm going to move to those, but I'm going to take advantage of the position of chair, if I may. First, Anne, just may I ask you a personal question about Columba here, or a question of my own. Would the gifts and I suppose the miracles that were associated with Columba, do you get a sense of his personality, or would you say that they are the reflections of Christ's miracles that are fairly common in hagiography? The reason I'm asking this is that you do get a very definite sense of a strong personality in the folklore.
Yes, that's right.
I'm just wondering about the liturgy.
Yes, I would agree. I tend to be very cautious, I'm sure you would be yourself, about making any kind of connection with lived experience, because a lot of these texts and melodies are part of a standard repertoire, part of standard formulae. But I do have to say that I think Columba, and also I would say probably in other saints' lives as well, there is that sense of closer contact, of a personal meaning, of a personal significance. And of course, in the case of Colum Cille in particular, we have Adamnon's life, which Brian Lacey, for example, and others have emphasized, shows a very close connection with the man himself. Yes. So I would think that in this way, this office does stand out, because the hagiography stands out in a similar fashion. And the way in which the texts are personalized to, for example, references to the sea, references to attacks from the outside and things like that. It's very local. It's very grounded.
Okay, so specific, right? Thank you, Anne. So I have a question in here. I've got many messages congratulating you on a beautiful presentation. There's a question here. Is there any trace of annotations or marginal entries in the Irish language in any of the sources that you mentioned for the Colum Cille office, and in particular the Kilcormac Missal?
No, you very rarely get references in Irish at all. Occasionally you might get a reference in a calendar to do with the local person who has died or something like that, in the obituaries, but not in the offices themselves, no.
Right. So another question here. Is this sort of music still commonly played in church today? And are these saints still celebrated in this way?
That's one of my favorite topics. The answer is no, but we're trying to make more people aware of it and to find a place for it. It doesn't, first of all, we don't have the Latin liturgy anymore, which is a great loss in terms of aesthetics and in terms of devotion, I would say. I'm not making any bigger statement about that, but I think it's part of the cultural memory of faith practice, which has really disappeared. And the other thing, of course, is the loss of Latin. But there are people, there's a huge surge of scholarly work going on in chant. And I'm glad to say, I think little by little, there is more awareness among the general public too. So I think it's our job. It's one of our jobs, one of our tasks, but it has fallen out of practice, especially since Vatican II, when everything became vernacularized. And sad to say, it was so assumed by a lot of people that meant we should no longer celebrate Mass in Latin, and everything became vernacular. I'm not making any statement or judgments at all about that, but I'm just trying to understand how that happened. And so I think there is room for it, and yeah, certainly there are lots of professional ensembles singing plain chant as well, and church choirs sometimes will bring it into the repertoire. But just to finish on that point, local saints are generally not known about. It would tend to be the Roman breviary, it would tend to be the Roman Missal, that would be the guide. And partly because they're not part of mainstream chant, but also because, well, I suppose you could say the research is still in a fairly early stage, but we would love to find more room for it. Yeah.
Yes, and I certainly remember the pre-Vatican II liturgies, and I am certainly with you there that they are a huge loss. The question in here, some of the questions are doubling up a little bit. There's another question about whether the offices are still sung to him today. But you've just answered. Is there a musical distinction? This is a very interesting question. Is there a musical distinction between Scottish and Gregorian chant?
Super question again, some things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and still do. I think that, well, there are two things. First of all, they are part of what you might call the universal chant repertory, the part of the universal Gregorian repertory. And in that sense, there's nothing new in terms of the styles of the melodies. But that said, there are sometimes nuances that can be found. For example, Barbara Hagiographic has a chapter in this book that we're bringing out on music and liturgy in medieval Britain and Ireland, in which she's looking at responsories for local saints in Irish and English offices and some continental. And she's finding certain nuances in the melodies. The good thing, or the interesting thing about chant is you have your melody, but really it's the nuances, some of which are recorded in the notation, and many of them were not recorded because it was oral tradition largely. And people knew the material so well. So what was written down was a mnemonic very often. And the reality of performance was much more nuanced than what you see on the page. So that's a long way around of saying that even if the melodies belong largely to a common stock or common style, what I like to think about is that there would have been a lot of local nuance in the performances. In other words, people were singing in their own way because there wasn't a standard singing style any more than there is in anything today either. So in other words, it's not what you see in the notes on the page, but presumably the local accent, the local flavour would have come through in the manners of performance.
Thank you, Anne. That's very clear. There's another question here. Acknowledging, of course, that music is central to the historical study of Iona. This person is also wondering if there were other musical, liturgical or textual contacts between Iona and continental churches during, say, the 8th century.
I'm sure there were. It wouldn't be an area that I know an awful lot about. I'm aware of the links between Salzburg and Iona, but I think, again, the wider church networks were extremely active.
Okay, question here, Anne. Is there any musical link between chants that you've spoken of and the Scottish Presbyterian tradition of presenting the psalms?
In the broader general sense, yes, and one thinks about the what is the name of them? What is the island? You remember? I'm sure somebody could remind me.
Lewis, probably.
Lewis, exactly. That's right. That stands out now, and it probably was something of a much broader and longer and more generally dispersed tradition. But yes, I would say yes in general, but we can't do very much with it in terms of evidence.
Yes. I'm just moving down here. So Colm Cille and Buhin, his successor as abbot, both died on and therefore were culted on the 9th of June. This might explain their both appearing in the same hymn in the office of that day. You're saying that this doesn't occur elsewhere with these two particular saints, but this Gilbert is saying that it happens with other pairs of saints who happen to share a feast day.
Yes, that is absolutely true. Yes. And of course, that brings up the question as to, was that actually the day he died? It's Gilbert Marcus, presumably, is asking the question. Yes, I guess so. He'll not know a lot more about this than I do. But the question of when a saint died and when the saint is commemorated could be an intentional fusion. I don't know in the case of Buhin, by the way. But for example, Gertrude of Nivelles, who was very much active in bringing Irish monasticism to her part of continental Europe. She engaged Irish monks to teach chant in that area. Her death date is the 17th of March. Now, again, I haven't had the chance to chase up that, but I think it could be an instance too where feasts coincide because saints are associated with one another.
Okay.
But I do say that I'm not an expert on this.
Okay. I think I can take two more questions. One from Maureen Nigonachu: is the reference to Colum Cille as king for 7 years an echo from other liturgical texts, or does it have a specific mention in relation to him?
I haven't come across it elsewhere in any of the offices, but having said that, there might be somebody watching who knows more about the subject, but so I really can't say very much more about it.
Okay. Thank you, Anne. And finally, this is the last question I think I can take. Well, maybe 2 more. Beyond Ireland and Scotland and the links with Salzburg, how widely was Columba commemorated in the liturgical calendar? It's from John Gallagher in UCD.
Not widely, actually, no, not widely at all, because the kinds of liturgical books that we're looking for don't survive in great numbers. And what we would need to know is any liturgical books associated with Irish communities that were active at that time. But I haven't I've come across a few French calendar references to him, but they're quite rare.
Okay. And
Jean-Michel Picard, excuse me, just to interrupt you there, I
yeah.
should acknowledge Jean-Michel Picard, who has written a lot on the cult of Colum Cille on the continent, and that might be a useful contact or a source for bibliographical follow-up.
Okay, and finally, are there any other saints from continental Europe with similar qualities of protection?
I would think it is a general, I think it is a general association with saints, actually. But the vividness with which Columba's role as protector in relation to the sea and in relation to human enemies and so on is unusual. Certainly protector against the devil, protector against evil, and mediator with God for salvation and for protection. It would be quite a common theme. Yeah, it's the way in which it's located that makes Columba's office rather different, rather unusual.
Okay. Well, we are drawing to a close now, and thank you all for your questions very much. And would you, just before we go, could you very briefly speak about the AVRA project?
I'd be happy to, yes. The AVRA project is an European consortium, which I direct. It actually came out of many years of my own work on manuscripts throughout Europe for Irish saints. I'm looking specifically at any liturgical celebration of Irish saints, whether in calendars or whether in offices. And having done a fair bit of footwork around continental European libraries as well as Britain and Ireland, I decided to make a consortium, and I have got 10 different countries and about 15 or 16 different partner organizations, people who are working with me in terms of information on local cults and looking in local libraries for manuscripts and helping with the wider hagiographic traditions involved, plus trying to link not just the liturgy, because the liturgy obviously is its own thing, but the liturgy doesn't exist in space. It links, especially the offices for saints, are the reason that they're there is because these things had meaning for people. So you'll find, and I like to remember the late great Cardinal O'Fee, who did much more footwork than I've done, going around to all sorts of centres in Europe where they have shrines and holy wells and church dedications and all of that. So I followed him to some extent in trying to find out where I might likely find manuscripts. And so my realization quickly enough was, it's all very well doing this and putting the stuff together, but first of all, why not share it? And second of all, why not bring in people with a lot of local information? So we have people in Würzburg, people in St Gallen and in Vienna and in Bologna and all over Europe now who are helping with this, because they may not all be liturgists, some of them are, but they are helping to bring in a wider context for this, and also hopefully to make to give back, if you like, to reflect back in contemporary life to people around Europe, not just the impact of the Irish saints, but the way in which this had a formative role in the development of European cultural heritage. And indeed, I found in my own, going around to conference, I went to a conference in Prague, and someone says, oh, we have a church of St. Gall here, who, by the way, is Havel in Czech, which I only learned then. And there was a wonderful story about, there's a skull relic of St. Gall actually in Prague. And so wherever I go, I'm finding these connections, and not only because I'm asking the questions, but actually it's actually in living memory that people still know a lot about the impact of the Irish missionary saints and the continuation of these memories through, especially through church foundations, but also, as I said, through Holy Wells, street names, for example, you know. So that's it in essence.
Well,
we're
thank you, Anne,
with it.
for whetting our appetite for that. Thank you again for a wonderful presentation. And just before we go, I'd like to thank a few other people, because this series is now drawing to an end. And we in the Royal Irish Academy have been delighted with how it has evolved. We are extremely grateful to our learned speakers, each of whom has offered us a feast in our 6 weeks. We're also extremely grateful to all our listeners who have shown up on Zoom week after week, and some people not every week perhaps, but that's overall we've had hundreds, and we thank you for your time and your attention. I also express thanks to colleagues, and I'm speaking here from on behalf of the Coistil Tanga na Gaeilge Lane na Gaeilge, Liturgy of na Gaeilge, agus na Gultúr Celtach. We express our thanks to colleagues in the Royal Irish Academy Library, under whose auspices this series has been produced, Barbara McCormick in particular. We've had great technical support from Eric and Grania, who have helped us avoid many unfortunate errors. Very grateful too to Colum O'Cuig, Charles Dillon for their work on the accompanying exhibition. And immense thanks are due to the chair of our committee, Antullav Morley Nick Owen, who has really carried this series from beginning to end. In terms of funding, we are hugely grateful to Malcolm Scott in Colum Cille, aptly named, for funding. In response to all the queries, practically with every question that came in, many of them anyway, asked when these lectures would be available. They are in the process of being edited, had preliminary edits of the first 2. This takes some time. We are very grateful to the staff in the RIA for doing this. They will all go up online in due course, so we can't say exactly when, but please keep an eye on social media and on the Academy site. So with that, fágam slán agah le gach duine ar míle buíochas gus go nua díobh sibh.